There's a kind of story that farming communities carry for generations. Not because it was dramatic in the way that fires or floods are dramatic, because it said something true about the things those communities value most. Passed from older men to younger ones, at feed store counters and at the edges of fields during the slow moments of planting season. Polished by the telling into something precise and clear that the original event may not have been in its moment but becomes in its memory. This is one of those stories, with more detail in the versions told by men who were there, and less in the versions told by men who heard it secondhand. But the essential shape of it has stayed consistent across all those tellings, because the essential shape of it is simple, and the simple things are the ones that survive. A man with an old red tractor, a man with a new green one, a bet made in a parking lot with 4 witnesses, 2 seasons of side-by-side corn ground making the argument that neither man made in words, and the ground telling the truth, the way ground always tells the truth. In October, when the combines go through and the weight tickets come back from the elevator and the numbers are what they are, nobody in Grundy County, Iowa, ever forgot the bet. Not because it was the largest bet ever made in that part of the state, or the most dramatic, or the one with the most money attached to it. They remembered it because of what it revealed about 2 men, and what it said about the difference between knowing something and understanding it. The bet was made on a Tuesday afternoon in May of 1983, in the parking lot of the Rhinebeck Coop, and it was witnessed by 4 men who were loading seed corn into the back of a pickup. All 4 of them would be asked about it over the years, and all 4 of them told the same story. The words were the same. The handshake was the same. The truck was the same truck. But to understand the bet, you have to understand the 2 men who made it, and the spring that led up to it, and what was at stake beyond the truck. The first man was Gerald Hoff, working ground that his father and his uncle had broken out in the 1920s on the south edge of the county near the Black Hawk Creek. Drainage. He farmed 308 acres, all of it owned free and clear, with equipment that his neighbors had been making comments about since at least 1978. The primary tractor in his operation was a 1957 Farmall 560 diesel that he had bought second-hand from a retiring farmer in 1969 for $1,800, and that he had been running ever since. He also kept a 1960 International 460 utility tractor for the lighter work, and a 1964 International 806 diesel that he ran for the heavy tillage. You have to understand what it means to grow up on a farm where equipment is maintained rather than replaced, where the machine shed is a working shop rather than a storage building, where a boy learns from the time he can hold a wrench that a tractor is not a disposable tool but a relationship. Gerald had been working on equipment alongside his father since he was 9 years old. Not in a formal teaching capacity, not with lessons scheduled at a workbench, but in the practical way that farming knowledge gets passed down by being present, by handing the right wrench when asked, by watching how a diagnosis is made on a tractor that is making a sound it wasn't making last week. Gerald's father Franklin had a saying that Gerald had heard so many times it had become part of the furniture of his thinking without him noticing when it happened. Franklin said, "A man who understands his equipment never gets surprised by it." What Franklin meant, and what Gerald understood completely by the time he was farming on his own, was that intimate knowledge of a machine produced a kind of predictive relationship with it. You knew which sounds were normal and which were not. You knew which temperatures in which conditions were acceptable and which told you to stop and investigate before you finished the field. This knowledge took years to acquire and could not be purchased with the new machine. It had to be earned, tractor by tractor, season by season, through sustained, close attention. Gerald had that knowledge of his 560 in a way that very few men have knowledge of any machine. He had owned it for 14 years by the time the bet was made. He had gone through every system in it at least once, usually more than once. He knew its specific fuel consumption at different loads and ground speeds, not from a manual, but from observation. He knew exactly how much throttle it needed to pull his 4-0 corn planter at the speed he preferred on different soil conditions without lugging or overspeeding the engine. He knew, from feel, when the torque converter was working at its best efficiency and when it wasn't. He knows what the brochure says. He knows what the dealer said. He learns the machine over time, season by season, the same way Gerald had learned the 560. But during those early seasons, the seasons of learning, he is working with a machine that is still somewhat a stranger to him, and that gap between familiarity and strangeness is not visible from the road, but shows up in the margins. Gerald was not a man who talked much. He was built wide and solid, with the kind of forearms that come from 30 years of physical work, and he had a slow way of considering a question before he answered it that some people misread as slowness of mind, and that was actually something closer to the opposite. He did not make fast judgments. He made careful ones, and he was usually right. The second man was Dale Fenton. Dale was 41 years old, which made him 6 years younger than Gerald, and he had come into farming later than most men in the county, having spent his 20s working in construction in Waterloo before coming back to Grundy County in 1975 when his father's health made it necessary. Dale was a talker where Gerald was quiet, a man who processed his thinking out loud and who found silence uncomfortable in a way that kept him filling it. He was not unintelligent. Dale had bought a new John Deere 4240 in the fall of 1982. It was a fine tractor, 130 horsepower, sound guard cab with heat and air conditioning, 8-speed power shift transmission. The list price that year was in the neighborhood of $42,000, and Dale had financed most of it at rates that in 1982 were still carrying the bruising interest environment of the early 80s. Not yet fully recovered from the peak rates of 1981, but still significantly higher than they would be by mid-decade. He was proud of the 4240 in the way that a man is proud of something he has committed to seriously. Proud in the particular way that makes a man want the thing he has committed to be validated by comparison. He drove it past Gerald Hoff's place more times than his fieldwork strictly required that spring. He talked about its fuel efficiency and its turning radius and the comfort of the cab at the Cope and at the elevator and at the diner where the dimers in the area had coffee on Tuesday mornings. Gerald heard all of this. Gerald always heard things. He just didn't often say much in response. What had been building toward the Tuesday in May was a specific conversation at the diner 2 weeks before the bet, in which Dale had been explaining to a table of men the economic argument for the new tractor in terms that left increasingly little room for any other position. He had gone through the horsepower comparison, the fuel consumption numbers from the dealer's literature, the time savings from the wider implement capacity, the reduced wear and tear from the improved hydraulics. Then he had said, directly and with the confidence of a man who considers the matter settled, that a man farming 300 acres with a 1957 tractor was leaving money on the table every single season, and that the only reason anyone would still be running that kind of equipment in 1983 was that they didn't understand what modern equipment could do or couldn't afford it, and in either case the result was the same. He had not looked directly at Gerald when he said this, but everyone at the table knew who he was talking about. Because Gerald Hoff was the only man in the county still farming his primary acres with a 1957 tractor. And everyone at the table knew it. Gerald drank his coffee and did not say anything. The 2 weeks between the diner conversation and the parking lot bet were not 2 weeks of planning for Gerald. He was not a man who spent time constructing strategy. And the position he arrived at in those 2 weeks was simply that he was willing to let the ground answer the question that Dale had raised at the diner table. He had always believed that the ground was the most honest participant in any farming conversation. Equipment manufacturers made claims about their machines that were accurate under optimal conditions. Salesmen presented numbers from demonstration fields managed specifically for demonstration purposes. Extension bulletins offered averages from research plots that were managed with more precision and more resources than any commercial farm operation. All of these inputs were real and useful, and none of them were the same as what happened in a specific field in a specific season under actual farming conditions. The only honest data in farming was what came out of your own fields, in your own seasons, under your own management, with your own equipment, in your own weather. Everything else was testimony. The elevator weight ticket was evidence. Gerald had 40 years of evidence about his ground, his equipment, his management approach. He was willing to let it make the argument. He drove home and went back to work. But something had settled in him that morning, something that Gerald Hoff, who was a careful man about most things, decided deserved a careful response, not an argument. He had no interest in arguing with Dale Fenton at a diner table, but something that would settle the question in the language that farming communities actually use to settle questions, which is the language of results. He thought about it for 2 weeks. Then on that Tuesday afternoon in May, when he and Dale happened to be at the Cope at the same time and the 4 men with the seed corn were loading in the parking lot, Gerald walked over to Dale's truck and said he had a proposition. Dale looked at him with the mild surprise of a man who has been half expecting something but isn't sure what form it will take. Gerald said it plain. He said he'd been hearing Dale's case for the new tractor all spring, and he wasn't going to argue with it in words. He said he'd rather settle it in the field. He proposed a 2-year test, head-to-head, same crop, their ground side by side, where it ran adjacent along the section line. At the end of 2 seasons, whoever averaged the higher yield per acre for both years combined bought the other man's truck. If Dale's John Deere 4240 operation beat Gerald's 1957 Farmall 560 operation over 2 full growing seasons, Gerald would sign over the title to his 1977 Ford F-250 pickup. If Gerald's operation beat Dale's, Dale would sign over the title to his 1981 Chevrolet Silverado. Dale looked at Gerald for a long moment. He was processing. The 4 men with the seed corn had stopped loading. Gerald said he was serious about the proposition and he was ready to shake on it right now if Dale was agreeable. Dale looked at the men with the seed corn. He looked back at Gerald. Then he said yes and put out his hand. They shook. One of the 4 witnesses, a man named Harlan Specht, who farmed north of Rhinebeck and who had been listening to Dale's tractor arguments at the diner all spring, said afterward that he had expected Gerald to be the one who looked uncertain after the handshake. Harlan said he thought that moment told you everything you needed to know about both men if you were paying attention. Before the first seed went in the ground for the bet, there is another dimension of the comparison worth understanding, which is the history of the 2 sections of ground that would carry the verdict. Gerald's section line field had been farmed by the Hoff family since 1928. Gerald's father, Franklin, had broken out the last timber edge along the creek drainage in the early 1930s and put the whole 60 acres into continuous row crop production by 1935. Franklin had also, beginning in 1947, started pulling soil cores from 6 fixed locations in the field every 3 years and sending them to the Iowa State Soil Lab for analysis. He kept those results in a binder in the farm office, and when he handed the operation to Gerald, the binder went with it. Gerald had continued the testing on the same 3-year schedule. By 1983, he had soil test data from that specific field going back 36 years. 12 testing cycles, enough data to see trends that single snapshots never reveal. The organic matter had gone from a baseline of around 4.2% in 1947 to 4.8% in 1983, a gain of about 0.6% over 36 years that represented real accumulated investment in the soil biology. The pH had been maintained in the 6 to 6.5 range throughout, without exception. The phosphorus and potassium were consistently adequate, not excessive, calibrated to what the soil tests showed rather than to what a blanket recommendation called for. That binder was a kind of proof, accumulated slowly over decades, that the ground had been treated as a long-term asset. Gerald did not show it to anyone. He kept it in the farm office, the same way he kept his equipment, maintenance logs, and his yield records. It was a record he maintained because he believed in knowing where you stood and what direction you were headed, and these were the numbers that told him. Dale's section line ground had a shorter documented history. His father had bought the farm in 1958, and the soil testing records went back only to 1965, 18 years of data compared to Gerald's 36. The trend in Dale's field was different. The organic matter had stayed relatively flat, oscillating between 3.8 and 4.1% across the testing periods, which was not bad ground by any measure, but was ground that had been maintained rather than improved. The pH management had been adequate. The nutrient levels had been adequate. But the trajectory was flat, where Gerald's was slowly upward, and flat ground can handle a drought year, but gently rising ground handles it better. None of this was visible from the road. Both fields looked like good Iowa black dirt because both fields were good Iowa black dirt. The difference between them was underground, in the structure and the biology and the accumulated history of what had been put back into them and what had been taken out. And it expressed itself not in visible ways, but in yield data, under stress, conditions, and in the way the crop root systems developed in dry July weather. The fields in question ran along the east side of the section line that divided the Hoft property from the Fenton property. Gerald had about 60 acres of corn ground on that side of his operation, ground he had been farming since the early 1970s. Dale had about 70 acres on his side, ground his father had farmed before him and that Dale had been working for 8 years. Both sections were Grundy County, black dirt, high organic matter, excellent natural fertility, the kind of ground that Iowa is famous for producing. The soil type didn't favor either man significantly, though anyone who knew both farms would say Gerald's ground had been managed more consistently over a longer period, and that the difference showed in the way the crops performed under stress. The spring of 1983 was wet in central Iowa. The planting window was compressed by a late cold spell followed by rain that kept the fields too wet to enter until nearly the 3rd week of May. Later than anyone wanted to be planting corn. When the ground finally came fit to work, the pressure to plant was intense. Because every day past the optimal planting date for central Iowa carries a yield penalty that compounds with heat and moisture. stress later in the season. Dale responded to the pressure the way a man with a new capable tractor naturally responds. He went in fast. The 4240 could pull his 12-row planter at a speed that covered ground quickly, and he pushed that advantage hard through the first week after the ground opened up. His field was planted in 4 days, which was genuinely impressive by any measure. He drove past Gerald's side of the section line on the evening of the 4th day with a satisfaction he didn't bother to conceal. Gerald planted in 7 days. Not because his tractor was incapable, but because he read the soil conditions differently than Dale did. On the 3rd day after the ground opened, when Dale was already running his second field, Gerald checked his side of the section line and decided the soil was still, carrying more moisture than he wanted at the depth where the seed would sit. He waited 1 more day before he started, and then he planted at a speed that he had decided, through experience with that specific ground, produced the most consistent seed-to-soil contact on the variable subsoil conditions that the drainage pattern in that field created. This kind of decision, the decision to wait 1 more day, to run the planter at a speed that is slightly slower than the equipment's maximum, to prioritize placement quality over throughput, is invisible from the road. When the combine goes through and the yield monitor tells the truth about every decision made from planting through harvest. The summer of 1983 was hot and dry across central Iowa in a way that nobody wanted, and that everyone knew it was happening, but that arrived before most farmers had fully prepared for it. July came in hard, with temperatures in the 90s for stretches that compressed the tasseling and silking window for corn into a stressed and difficult period. Rainfall was sporadic and insufficient, and the weeks without significant moisture stretched long enough that even the best managed ground in the county was showing some stress by early August. Both fields showed stress that summer. The visual difference between them through July and into early August was not dramatic enough that a man driving past on the road would have stopped and taken note of it. But a man walking the rows, which Gerald did every few days through that difficult stretch, could see it in the way the leaves flagged in the afternoon heat and in the way the silks were developing on the ears. Gerald's side was holding better, not dramatically, not in a way that invited easy explanations. But the stand was more uniform from one end of the field to the other, which meant the stress was distributed more evenly across the crop, which meant fewer individual plants were hitting their critical development stages at the worst moments of the drought, while others had already passed through them. Dale's side had more variability. There were zones where the stand was excellent and the stress was moderate, and zones where the stand had been slightly uneven from the beginning and where the drought hit harder because the plants in those zones had shallower root development from the variable soil conditions at planting. There is a specific kind of attention that a farmer gives his crop during a drought that is different from the attention he gives it in a normal season. In a normal season, you walk the fields to check for pest pressure and disease and the various developmental stages that tell you when the next management step is due. You are gathering information to make decisions. During a drought, you walk the fields for a different reason. You are assessing damage, trying to understand the scope of what is happening, tracking which parts of the field are holding and which parts are breaking. You are making the calculations that drought forces on every farmer, the calculations about what the final yield is going to be and whether it will be above or below, the thresholds that determine whether the season covers its costs and whether the decisions that still lie ahead, the fungicide pass, the final nitrogen application, are worth making, or whether the crop has already been compromised past the point where those inputs pay. Gerald walked his section line field in the early mornings during that July, before the heat of the day made the stress signals harder to read clearly. He noted which rows were showing the rolled leaf flagging that indicated moisture stress, and which rows were still holding flat. And he recorded his observations in a small notebook that he carried in his shirt pocket during those walks. The notebook was not for anyone else. It was how he organized his own thinking during a period when the information was changing day by day, and he needed to track the trajectory. What the notebook showed over the 2 weeks of July, when the drought was at its most acute, was that his field was handling the stress in a more distributed way than he had feared it might. But it was appearing relatively uniformly across the field, rather than concentrating in the areas of greater stand variability that he had identified during the season. That uniform distribution meant the critical development windows were synchronized enough across the D population that the ear fill was not going to be catastrophically compromised in any one zone while the rest of the field came through. He put the notebook back in his pocket and drove to the other end of the field and walked it from that direction, confirming what the first walk had shown. Both men watched their fields. Neither spoke to the other about what they were seeing. Before that October harvest, there had been one more moment in the summer of 1983 that Gerald thought about afterward. Not because it changed anything, but because it illustrated something he had always believed about the relationship between equipment and the man running it. It was late July, at the peak of the drought stress, and Gerald was walking his section line field in the early morning, the way he did every several days through a difficult stretch of weather, reading the crop the way a doctor reads a patient. He was looking at the ear development, checking how the silks were progressing, making the assessment of whether the critical pollination window had been successfully navigated, or whether the timing of the drought stress had put enough plants into that window at the wrong moment to affect the final ear fill. He came out of the field at the road end and saw Dale on the other side of the section line. Not in his field, but standing at the edge of it, watching his crop from the road. Dale had his arms crossed, and his face was tight in a way that suggested he was seeing something he didn't like but wasn't sure what to do about it. Gerald thought about crossing the road and saying something, but he considered what the right thing to say would be, and he couldn't think of anything that would be useful rather than simply salt in an open wound. So he said nothing and walked back to his truck and went on with his day. Dale's field was showing the stress more than Gerald's. Both men knew it. There was nothing Gerald could have said that would change it. And saying it would not have served the kind of honest respect that both men had for each other despite the competitive edge of the bet. Sometimes the right thing to do is say nothing and let the season be the season. Gerald drove back to his shop and checked the hydraulic fluid level on the 5060 and put in a quart that it was slightly low on, which was a thing he'd been meaning to do for a week and which took him 4 minutes and cost him nothing because he bought hydraulic fluid by the case and always had it on the shelf. Then he drove to the other end of his field and walked the crop from that direction, completing the circuit, reading what he needed to read. The harvest came in October with the cool weather that Iowa always delivers after a hard summer, and both men ran their combines through their respective fields in the same week. The weight tickets came back from the elevator. Gerald's 60 acres on the section line averaged 149 bushels per acre. Dale's 70 acres on the section line averaged 131 bushels per acre. The difference was 18 bushels to the acre, which on 60 and 70 acres respectively was not a small number. At the corn prices available in October of 1983, running between $3.10 and $3.30 per bushel, That gap represented several $1,000s of additional income from ground that was side by side, under the same sky, with the same rain. The terms of the bet had specified a 2-year average. 1 year was not enough. Both men knew it, and neither suggested otherwise. The 1983 season was complete. The score was clear. 1 more year to run. The winter between the 2 seasons was where the less visible work happened, as it always does in farming. Gerald spent that winter the way he spent every winter, going through his equipment methodically, working through a list that he kept on a clipboard in the shop. He rebuilt the carburetor on the 460. He replaced the hydraulic pump seal on the 56T, which had been seeping slightly since October. A job he diagnosed and completed himself in an afternoon, using a seal kit he'd ordered from a supplier in Ames for $14. He sharpened and reset his cultivator sweeps. He replaced the worn coulters on his planter and checked every seed meter to make sure each one was delivering seeds consistently. He also spent time that winter walking his ground on dry days, looking at the way the soil had settled over the winter, checking the drainage patterns in the low spots, noting a section of the section-line field where the fall tillage had left a slight depression that was holding water longer than he wanted it to. He made a note to address that depression in his spring tillage pass, running the field in a direction that would move the high and low spots slightly, improving the surface drainage by a few inches of elevation difference that most people would never notice. These are the kinds of decisions that are impossible to explain to someone who hasn't spent years learning a specific piece of ground. They are not dramatic. They are not visible. But they compound. Every small correction, every adjustment that comes from knowing this particular soil in this particular drainage situation adds something to the total performance of the field that shows up in the yield at harvest and nowhere else. Dale spent that winter making payments on the 4,240 and talking at the COPE about the new planter he was considering. A 12-row unit with better downforce management that he thought would help withstand uniformity on the variable ground he'd been seeing in his fields. The spring of 1984 arrived with better conditions than 1983, giving both men a fair shot at optimal planting timing without the pressure of the previous year's late start. Dale planted his section-line ground in 3 days, taking full advantage of the 40-40's capacity and the improved conditions. Gerald planted his in 5 days, slightly faster than the year before, because the soil conditions were more uniform and allowed him to maintain his preferred speed throughout, without the pauses the previous year had required. The summer of 1984 was near normal for central Iowa, which is to say it was the kind of summer that favors the farms where the fundamentals are, right? Where the soil structure and the stand uniformity and the nutrient availability are all where they need to be. Because a near-normal summer doesn't deliver the extreme stress events that expose deficiencies dramatically. Instead, it rewards steady excellence with steady, excellent yields, and the gaps between operations appear in their quieter form. Not as the dramatic difference between a stressed crop and an unstressed one, but as the consistent accumulation of small advantages that add up across 130 acres of side-by-side ground. Gerald's section-line ground averaged 164 bushels per acre that fall. Dale's section-line ground averaged 147 bushels per acre. The gap had widened slightly from the first year. 17 bushels to the acre in 1984 compared to 18 in 1983. For a 2-year average of about 17.5 bushels per acre in Gerald's favor. The bet was settled. The conversation between the two men happened at Gerald's machine shed on a Saturday morning in November, 3 weeks after both of them had their final yield numbers from the elevator. Dale drove over in the Silverado, which was what was at stake, and the two men stood in the yard in the November cold, and Gerald confirmed the yield numbers he had, and Dale confirmed the yield numbers he had. And both of them knew the arithmetic was clear, and neither of them pretended otherwise. Dale said the tractor had been better equipment. Gerald didn't disagree with that. The 4240 was a better tractor by any objective measure of what a tractor is, as a machine. Gerald said the field averaged what the field averaged. Dale was quiet for a moment. Then he said he thought he understood now what the difference was, but he wanted to hear Gerald say it, if Gerald was willing. Gerald thought about how to answer that. He was still not a man who used words when he didn't have to. But he said, "Dale, the tractor does what you tell it. The ground does what the ground does. The better you know the ground, the more of what the ground does goes your direction." Dale nodded. He handed Gerald the title to the Silverado. Gerald thanked him. Dale drove home in the Ford F250 that Gerald had offered as the other side of the bet, which was a good truck and ran well, and Gerald added the Silverado to his fleet and kept running both trucks, using one for farm work and one for everything else, until one of them wore out. The story did not end there, though that is where most people who tell it stop. Which is to say, it was measured and observational, rather than celebratory or judgmental. The men at the coop and the diner and the elevator knew the yield numbers, because yield numbers move through a farming community the way water moves through tile, quietly and efficiently, and most of them had a reading on the result before the November Saturday when Dale drove his Silverado over to Gerald's place. A quiet updating of the models that people in that community used to understand what good farming looked like, and what the relationship between equipment and outcome actually was. Some of those updates were conscious and some were not. But the fact of what had happened was in the air of every agricultural conversation in that part of Grundy County for the next couple of seasons, informing opinions without being named directly in most of them. Harold Fenner, who ran the coop and had been watching the farming families in that township for 25 years, said that the bet and its outcome did something useful for the community. That no amount of extension service literature on soil management and equipment economics had been able to do, which was make the argument concrete and local and specific rather than abstract and general and theoretical. Nobody disputes an argument when it's about someone else's ground in another county. Everybody thinks about it when it's about the 60 acres they drive past every day on the way to town. He said the fall of 1983 was the first time he could remember farmers in the area asking questions about soil organic matter at the coop counter rather than asking questions about what horsepower the next generation of tractors was going to offer. The questions were small and they were cautious, and most of the men asking them were careful not to draw the connection to the bet out loud, because that would have required acknowledging something that touched on their own choices and their own equipment. But the questions were there, and they were new, and Harold attributed them directly to the visible comparison that Gerald and Dale had made in the section line fields. What happened over the next 2 years after the bet was settled is the part that says something more important than the bet itself about who Dale Fenton actually was. Dale spent the winter of 1984 to 1985 thinking about what he had seen in those 2 seasons. He was a man who formed conclusions quickly, as noted, but he was also a man who could update those conclusions when the evidence required it, which is a quality rarer than the forming of conclusions and more valuable. He had gone into the bet certain that the equipment was the variable. He came out of it understanding that the equipment was not the primary variable. He started asking questions the following spring that he had not been asking before. He asked the county extension agent about soil organic matter and what affected it, and what the trajectory of his specific fields looked like in the testing data going back to when his father had farmed. He asked an older farmer named Vernon Stiles, who had been farming in that county since the 1940s and who had a reputation for knowing soil in the way that very long experience produces, whether Vernon would be willing to walk some of Dale's ground with him and tell him what he saw. Vernon walked 3 of Dale's fields over the course of 2 weekends in April. He said some useful things and some things that took Dale a while to understand fully, but that it had been managed in a way that was drawing on its natural fertility without fully replenishing it, and that the effect of that was cumulative in the negative direction. That the ground would continue to produce, but that it would produce less consistently under stress than it should, and that the gap between what it was producing and what it was. He asked Vernon what he would change. Vernon told him. What Dale did in the following 2 years, beginning in the spring of 1985, was a systematic reworking of his management approach on the fields he was most concerned about. He pulled soil samples from a tighter grid than he'd been using and had them analyzed, not just for the standard nutrients, but for organic matter percentage and cation exchange capacity. He adjusted his fertilizer program based on what the tests showed, rather than what the dealer recommended as a standard rate for the area. He modified his tillage approach on the section line field specifically, reducing the intensity of the fall tillage to leave more residue on the surface and reduce the erosion that had been slowly thinning his topsoil on the slight slope that ran through the middle of the field. He also did something that required more of him than any of the agronomic adjustments. Without calling ahead, and said he had some questions about how Gerald managed his specific ground if Gerald was willing to talk about it. Gerald was willing. They talked for 2 hours in the shop, with the space heater running and the smell of oil and cold metal around them, and Gerald answered every question Dale asked without making anything of the fact that Dale was asking. He showed Dale his soil test records. Going back to 1964, he explained his rotation and why he ran it the way he ran it. He talked about the drainage tile he'd put in on the section line field in 1971 and what difference it had made in how the ground responded in wet springs. The specific assessment of soil condition that determined whether he ran the planter at the speed the equipment could handle or at the speed the soil was ready for. Dale took notes in a small spiral notebook he'd brought. He did not say much during the 2 hours. He asked questions and listened to the answers. It was a different way of being in a conversation than his usual approach, and Gerald noticed it without remarking on it. When Dale left, Gerald went back to the winter maintenance list he'd been working through and picked up where he'd stopped. He did not think especially much about the conversation. It was the kind of conversation that had always been available if Dale had wanted to have it. The 1985 and 1986 growing seasons on Dale's section line ground showed improvement. Not dramatic improvement, not the kind that announced itself at the coot counter, but measurable improvement, visible in the soil test data and in the yield numbers and in the way the crop performed during the dry spell that came through in July of 1985 and stressed the county's corn crop more selectively than a full drought would have, revealing which fields had the soil structure and the moisture holding capacity to get through it. By the fall of 1986, Dale's section line field was averaging yields that were closing the gap with Gerald's side. Not all the way closed, but significantly narrowed. He bought back his Silverado in the fall of 1986. Gerald had been maintaining it well, as he maintained all of his equipment, and it was in good shape. Dale paid fair market value for it, which was more than the truck would have brought at a casual sale because it had been kept up, and which was a number that by coincidence worked out to roughly 3 times what the truck had been worth at the time of the bet in 1983. Not because Gerald inflated the price, but because a well-maintained truck holds its value, and a 3-year-old truck in good shape was simply worth what it was worth. Dale paid the 3 times without complaint. He considered it fair. The conversation in Gerald's machine shed on the February morning when Dale came to ask questions was one that both men remembered differently in its details, but consistently in its essential character. Dale remembered feeling something that he had not expected to feel, which was the particular discomfort of realizing that the knowledge he needed had been available all along in the person he had spent 2 years in implicit competition with. The information was there. Gerald would have talked about soil management and planting decisions and drainage any time Dale had asked. The only thing preventing the conversation from happening sooner was that Dale had not asked, had not needed to ask while he was confident that the equipment was the primary variable, and had only arrived at the point of asking after 2 years of evidence had pushed him there. Gerald remembered the conversation as unremarkable, which said something about Gerald's character. Directly, and without condescension, and without making the questioner feel that the question was something they should already know the answer to. He showed Dale his soil test records, not as a demonstration of superiority, but as evidence for the points he was making. The same way he'd have shown anyone those records if they were relevant to the conversation. The most important thing Gerald told Dale that morning was something that Dale had not thought to ask about specifically, which was the relationship between planting speed and stand uniformity on variable subsoil conditions. Gerald explained that the specific section line field had a drainage variation across its width that created different moisture conditions at seed depth depending on where you were in the field on any given planting day, and that running the planter at a speed that was faster than the soil's drainage characteristics could support at the least favorable locations resulted in inconsistent seed placement depth and inconsistent germination, which compounded through the season into the stand variability that Dale had been seeing in his field's performance under stress. This was not information Dale could have gotten from a brochure or a dealer or even most agronomists who hadn't spent time in that specific field. It was knowledge produced by years of close observation of one particular piece of ground, the kind of knowledge that is not transferable as a general principle but only as a specific insight about a specific place. Gerald had it about his ground because he had been farming it for a long time and paying close attention throughout. Dale could have it about his ground too, eventually, if he was willing to pay the same kind of attention over the same kind of time. Told at the cope, and at the diner, and at the elevator, in the way that well-made comments get told when they earn their place in the community's memory. He said, "Gerald, I'm buying back this truck at triple what it would have been worth in the bet because you maintained it right. That's the same reason you won the bet to begin with. You manage what you've got better than I manage what I've got." That was true of the truck and it was true of the ground, and I'll be spending the next several years seeing if I can change the second part. Gerald said that seemed like a good plan. They shook hands again, which was the right way to end the thing that the first handshake had started. The years that followed settled into the ordinary rhythm of 2 men farming adjacent ground in the same county under the same conditions, each watching his yields and his soil and his costs and making the adjustments that a thoughtful farmer makes season by season. Dale's ground improved. It improved measurably and consistently, the way ground improves when management is right. Slowly enough that no single season marks the change, but clearly enough that the accumulation over several seasons is unambiguous. Gerald continued farming the way he always had. He replaced the 5060 in 1989 with a used 1974 International 1066 that he bought for $4,800 cash, a machine in good mechanical condition that he went through systematically before putting it in the field. The 5060 went into the corner of the machine shed, retired from field work, but maintained in running condition because Gerald was not the kind of man who let a machine that had served him well deteriorate into a parts pile. Dale's 4240 continued to be the better tractor in the absolute sense that a newer, more powerful machine is always better equipment than an older, lower-powered one. Gerald never disputed this. He had not disputed it during the bet either. What he had disputed, without quite saying so in the diner that morning before the bet, was the assumption that the better equipment was the thing that determined the better outcome. The Fields made the argument he didn't make in words. The Fields made it twice, over 2 seasons. In the language that cannot be edited or spun or explained away, which is the language of wait tickets at the elevator. Vernon Stiles, the older farmer who walked Dale's ground with him in the spring of 1985, died in 1991 at 83 years old. He had been farming in Grundy County since he was 19, working ground that his own father had broken before him, and by the end of his life he had accumulated the kind of knowledge about soil in that specific county that cannot be taught in a classroom or read in a publication, because it exists only in the intersection of a specific landscape and a long lifetime of close attention to it. When Dale came to him in the spring of 1985 and asked him to walk his ground, Vernon did it without any fanfare, the same way Gerald had answered Dale's questions in the machine shed, with the directness and the lack of condescension that the farming tradition at its best brings to the transmission of knowledge from older to younger. Vernon told Dale something about the section line field that no soil test had explicitly revealed, which was that the drainage pattern through the middle of the field was affecting the moisture and temperature at seed depth differently in different parts of the field on any given planting day, and that this variation was the reason the stand consistency was inconsistent across the field, and the reason the yield dropped more sharply in dry conditions than the soil test numbers suggested it. He had watched Dale's father farm it and seen the same pattern. He had not said anything because nobody had asked him. And in that community you did not offer opinions about another man's land management unless he asked for them. Dale had finally asked. Vernon had finally said. And the information that had been sitting in one man's head for 20 years transferred to another in an afternoon. The way useful knowledge moves when the conditions for it are finally right. Harlan Specht, who had been one of the witnesses in the Cope parking lot and who lived long enough to see the full arc of the story, said many years later that what he remembered most about the whole business was not the bet, or the yield numbers, or even the truck changing hands twice. He said Gerald had not looked triumphant, or excited, or anxious. He had looked the way a man looks when he has decided something, and is satisfied with the decision and is simply waiting for the outcome to confirm what he already knows. Like a farmer, Harlan said, who has looked at his soil in the morning and knows what the weather is going to do to it that day. Settled, patient, already sure of what the ground is going to tell him. That is Gerald Hoff. That is the kind of farmer who wins a bet about equipment with a man who has better equipment. Not because he gets lucky, not because the conditions happen to favor him, but because he has been paying attention to the right things for long enough that when the moment comes to let the ground speak, he already knows what it is going to say. He had always known. He just let Dale find out the way you find out things that actually matter, which is not in a diner conversation but in the field. Over time, in the accumulation of harvests that tell you exactly where you stand. The John Deere 4240 that Dale had bought in the fall of 1982 was still running when Dale retired from full-time farming. In 2004, he had kept it maintained, and it had served him well for 22 years, which is a testament to the quality of the machine and also a testimony to the fact that Dale, once he understood what maintenance actually meant, had become a man who took care of his equipment with a seriousness he had not brought to it in the early years. He also bought, in 1988, an older used tractor to supplement his main machine. It was a 1967 International 856 diesel, bought at an estate sale for $2,200 in good mechanical condition. He ran it for the lighter work and for the second tractor situations that any growing operation creates. He did his own maintenance on it from the beginning, following the pattern he had learned partly from Vernon Stiles and partly, indirectly, from the understanding of why Gerald Hoff's approach had produced the results it produced. Gerald noticed when the red tractor appeared in Dale's yard. He didn't say anything about it, but he noticed. The farms on either side of that section line in Grundy County are still farmed today by the next generation of each family. Gerald's son operates the Hoff ground with the same basic philosophy his father used, updated for the decades that have passed and the changes in agronomy and equipment that those decades brought, but rooted in the same conviction that the soil is the primary asset and everything else is in service to it. Dale's son operates the Fenton ground with an approach that is more different from his father's early years than the Hoff ground is from Gerald's father's time, because Dale's management changed significantly after 1985, and the changes he made compounded forward into what his son inherited. The section line fields on both sides produce well now, closer in their performance than they were in 1983, because the gap that Gerald's superior soil management had opened up over decades has been slowly closed by the sustained effort Dale put into closing it starting in 1985. That closing of the gap is itself a lesson, perhaps the most important one in the story. The gap between what good soil management produces and what adequate soil management produces is not fixed and permanent. It can be closed. It takes time, and it takes honest assessment, and it takes the willingness to change things that are not producing what they should, but it can be done. Dale Fenton did it over the course of the decade after the bet, not completely and not all at once, but measurably and consistently, season by season, the same way good farming always works. The bet was the beginning of that process for Dale, not the end of it. The bet was the moment when the evidence became undeniable enough that a man who formed conclusions quickly had to update his conclusions. And when he updated them all the way. He did not half-update them. He did not acknowledge the soil management point while maintaining the position that the equipment was still the primary variable. He updated his understanding of what farming was and what it required, and then he farmed accordingly. That is how the story ends on Dale's side of it. Not with defeat, but with education. Not with the loss of a truck, but with the gaining of a framework that made him a meaningfully better farmer for the rest of his working life. And on Gerald's side, it ends the way most stories about men who farm with patience and knowledge and without drama end, which is quietly and without a specific ending moment. The seasons continuing in their rhythm, the soil tests continuing their slow upward trend, the equipment continuing to be maintained and to run, and the yield data at the elevator continuing to say what it has always said. The ground is honest. The man who listens to it most carefully is the man who hears it most clearly. Gerald Hoff listened. He had been listening since he was 9 years old in the machine shed with his father, learning which wrench to hand and what sound the engine made when it needed attention, and why it mattered that you addressed the small things before they became large ones. 40 years of listening, that was the whole of the advantage. That was everything. And the ground confirmed it, 1 October at a time, for as long as Gerald Hoff was in the field, to hear it answer back. There is one more detail from that Tuesday afternoon in May of 1983 that Harlan Specht mentioned every time he told the story, because he felt it was the detail that revealed the most about Gerald Hoff and about what kind of man you had to be to make a bet like that and mean it. After the handshake, after Dale had gotten in his truck and driven out of the Cope parking lot, after the other 3 men had exchanged a look between themselves and gone back to loading their seed corn, Gerald had walked to his own truck without any particular expression on his face and driven back toward his farm. Harlan had watched him go. Then Harlan had stood in the parking lot for a moment thinking about what he had just witnessed, because there was something about the whole exchange that he was trying to put his finger on. It took him until he was pulling into his own driveway that evening before he understood what it was. Gerald had not looked like a man who had just made a bet. He had looked like a man who had just made a plan. There is a difference between those two things, and the difference is certainty. A man making a bet doesn't know how it will come out. A man making a plan has already worked out the likely outcome and is simply setting the conditions for it to unfold. Gerald Hoff had walked out of that parking lot already knowing, or believing with the kind of confidence that is functionally the same as knowing, what 2 seasons of side-by-side corn ground were going to show. He had been managing his ground carefully for 30 years. He had soil test records going back to 1947. He had yield data from every season he had farmed. He understood the specific drainage variation in his section line field, and how it affected plant development under stress conditions. He knew what his old red Farmall had produced on that ground in every kind of weather the county had. Delivered since 1969, he was not betting, he was proposing a demonstration. The distinction is everything. And Harlan Specht, standing in a Cope parking lot in May of 1983, watching a man in worn overalls climb into a truck that was going to be the winning side of a wager before the wager was 6 months old, understood the distinction even if it took him until his driveway to name it. Some men bet on their equipment. Some men bet on their ground. The men who bet on their ground have usually been listening to it long enough to know what it will say. Gerald Hoff had been listening for 30 years. He was not going to lose the truck.